right? Dynasty managers, this is the true test of how much do you value landing spot for wide receivers in the NFL and for rookies, because by most standards, Baltimore is the worst possible landing spot, like the absolute worst. It was a great pick for the Ravens to take Bateman back in the first round, but it was absolutely crushing for fantasy. With all that being said, Bateman, I think he might actually be a buy low in some leagues because his value is absolutely tanked right now. And if he doesn't produce year one, I think people are going to leave him for dead. And you won't be able to get anything for him if you took him in drafts. But I think you still got to take him early to mid-second in Superflex. But Alex, what do you think about this Bateman selection?
I love it for Baltimore. I think they got a great talent and the right pick here at the end of the first round.
Let me say one thing. I actually don't like the pick for Baltimore.
Really? That's surprising. I would have liked to see them take Elijah Moore, someone in the slot who's going to help Lamar throwing across the middle. He does tend to struggle throwing to the outside. But as far as talent goes, I think they got the right guy.
So Bateman is a phenomenal prospect. At times, he is my wide receiver too, right behind Jamar Chase in this class. Like, he is that good. He was a stud 3-year monster producer against competition in college. His numbers in college were gaudy numbers. Why didn't they get somebody to play the Dez Bryant role for Lamar Jackson? Give Lamar a player with a catch radius.
What Dez Bryant role? Dez Bryant played like 2 games.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They tried. They tried to actually – we were like, hey, they need to bring in a big body receiver like Dez Bryant. They actually tried to revitalize Dez Bryant. Didn't work. Why don't you go and get at least like a Terrace Marshall, some kind of, a big body wide receiver? I know there weren't a ton of those in this class. You already have Hollywood Brown to play this field stretcher role. I mean, this is clearly Rashod Bateman coming in to be the wide receiver 1 on this team.
It's tough, and I see what you're saying there, but I think for the Ravens, they have Mark Andrews, who's a great red zone threat. They love to use the 2 tight ends. I think we'll continue to see Nick Boyle used as well. Obviously, if I'm talking about Nick Boyle as your number 2 red zone threat, that's a concern. But Rashod Bateman, my comp for Rashod Bateman throughout this whole draft process, and it's a popular comp in the industry, is Stephon Diggs. And when I think about what the Ravens are doing here with this Rashod Bateman pick, I think it can be compared to what Buffalo just did bringing in Stephon Diggs. Now, obviously, Stephon Diggs had several years of proven production with the Minnesota Vikings. He wasn't getting targeted as much as he needed to be, as much as he thought he should be, so he went to Buffalo. And this Buffalo team is a team with Josh Allen in 2019 with no Stephon Diggs that completed 58% of his passes.
Yikes.
And only threw 461 attempts. Lamar Jackson last season completed 64% of his passes, better completion percentage significantly, 376 attempts. So those attempts are too low. But look what happened when Josh Allen got Stephon Diggs. His attempts went from 461 to 572. His completion percentage went from 58 to 69. And I'm not saying that was all Stephon Diggs, but look at what happens when you get a true alpha wide receiver 1 that can get open not only inside the 20, not only on jump balls in the red zone, but all across the field. And I think that's what the Ravens are hoping for in Rashod Bateman. That's what they're hoping he becomes, because Lamar Jackson has been playing. Say what you want about his accuracy. Say what you want about him throwing to the outside. Say what you want about his struggles as a passer and the volume. But his wide receiver 1 has been Hollywood Brown, who's fine. He's a good field stretcher. He is not an alpha wide receiver 1 in the NFL. And I think most people will agree with me on that. No debate necessary. And before that, as a rookie, Lamar Jackson's number 1 wide receiver was a washed Michael Crabtree and John Brown, who was hit or miss whether he was even going to be on the field or not. So it's tough to blame Lamar Jackson for all the passing struggles that he's had when he hasn't had a true alpha wide receiver 1. So Rashod Bateman is going to be the test. In 2021, I think we're going to see it. Are we going to see Lamar Jackson start to ascend as a passer in a similar way that we've seen from Josh Allen? Or is he going to be the same guy? Because if we see any level of improvement this year, if Lamar Jackson can get up to, I know there's 17 games, so 450 to 475 attempts, which is nothing crazy. That's still low.
That's bottom half of the league by far.
If he can add 75, 100 attempts, if he can take that completion percentage from 64 to 67, 68, we could start to see this offense look totally different. I think they're going to be in higher scoring games this season. I think Harbaugh is trying to be a little bit more two-dimensional. They've been so one-dimensional with the run that it's really got their Achilles heel in some of these playoff games. So I think they want to open up the pass. I think that's why they drafted Bateman. And I think in 2021, we're going to see it. I don't think we're going to necessarily see the same immediate ascension we saw from Josh Allen, because Stephon Diggs at this point of his career is a totally more well-rounded player than Bateman's going to be as a rookie. But if we start to see Lamar Jackson take a step forward this season, if Bateman can get 70, 80 targets and be efficient with them and show that he's going to be good, I think we might be onto something with Bateman here.
I actually don't have a problem at all with Lamar Jackson as a passer. All of his metrics are actually about middle of the pack. He's actually a super efficient passer. He's 4th in air yards per attempt, top 10 in red zone completion percentage, top 12 in passing touchdowns, led the league in passing touchdowns in 2019. Very solid completion rates, you've already mentioned. He had the slight regression from 66% his first year, 64% in year 2 as a starter, but those are both top half of the league in terms of completion rate. And then he's middle of the pack everywhere else. 17th in true yards per attempt, 20th in completed air yards, 15th in passer rating. Just middle of the pack as a passer. A serviceable passer in the NFL. We know what he can do on the ground. We don't need to talk about that anymore. And I think to your point, like, we've seen crazy things happen. We saw Josh Allen take a massive jump from what he could do as a quarterback. We saw Tim Tebow get signed to be the next Taysom Hill in Jacksonville. We're seeing crazy things happen right now. We're seeing crazy things happen. So I'm not going to say it's never going to happen, or it's out of the realm of possibility that the Ravens are going to pass more. But I think even those points could have some fallacies, especially for Bateman. We have Sammy Watkins in a 1-year, $5 million contract. He's 27 years old. But at least they went to go get a veteran. I think Watkins is potentially a year away from being just totally washed. But I think he'll get targets when he's on the field this year. They drafted Rashod Bateman in the first round, Tylan Wallace in the 4th round, and this front office has been taking dart throw after dart throw with this high-end draft capital and whiffing on wide receivers. They took Hollywood Brown, essentially exactly where they took Bateman at the 125 in 2019. They also took Miles Boykin in the 3rd that year, and then last year took Devin Duvernay in the 3rd. They're just trying to get these speedy outside wide receivers to let Lamar throw the ball deep, and that's reflected in his air yards per attempt being top 5 in the league, but no one's coming down with those passes. And so hopefully that's what Rashod Bateman can do. I'm more worried, though, about how this offense is built, and the volume is the real concern, which you've already alluded to it. Everybody knows the Ravens were bottom 2 in pass attempts the last 2 seasons. You got Mark Andrews taking up a 23 and 25% target share. This team just doesn't pass the wide receiver position. And I was looking through Greg Roman's history as an offensive coordinator. All of his offenses throughout his career have typically been top 5 in rushing attempts and bottom 5 in passing attempts and bottom 5 in passing yards. His best season from a passing standpoint was when he was with Jim Harbaugh as the OC with Colin Kaepernick and Alex Smith, and they were 23rd in passing yards that year. Still in the bottom half of the league. And they almost always use a tight end pretty significantly in Greg Roman's scheme. He's had players like Charles Clay as relevant fantasy options and heavily utilized players in these offenses. We saw Vernon Davis have monster years with the 49ers when Greg Roman was there. This offense just doesn't actually utilize the wide receiver position. That's the real problem with this landing spot, not necessarily Lamar's passing acumen, more just how the offense is built. I'm seeing narratives thrown around with Rashod Bateman's situation, very similar to DK Metcalf or A.J. Brown's situation, where they enter prolific offenses that don't pass the ball a ton. But let's just say Rashod Bateman can fit into that role, can be a 1,000-yard receiver who has boom weeks. Let's play this out. Let's just say Rashod Bateman is just a better version of Hollywood Brown in every way, because I don't think that's too bad. Hollywood Brown's best season was last year. He was the wide receiver 36 in fantasy, 11.4 fantasy points per game in PPR leagues, 100 targets, 56 receptions, 13.2 yards per reception, and 8 total touchdowns. So a touchdown every other game, phenomenal from a touchdown perspective for Hollywood Brown. really blew up towards the back half of 2020. So is it reasonable a season from now in 2022 for Bateman to see 115 targets, so slightly more than Brown, 72 receptions, slightly more than Brown from 56 to 72, slightly more efficient, 14 yards per reception. We have Hollywood Brown, who, super small guy, he runs out of bounds, he'll just fall to the ground, he does not want to take big hits. You get Rashod Bateman, who's making guys miss, is electric in the open field. Let's just conservatively say he goes from the 13.2 yards per reception that Hollywood Brown had up to 14. That gets him to 1,008 yards. We sprinkle a few touchdowns in there in this efficient, high-scoring offense. Let's just say it's 6 touchdowns, which is that's 2 less than Hollywood Brown got. That's 209 fantasy points in PPR leagues, that whole stat line. And that's 2020 Cooper Kupp. It's not a world beater. It's not a game changer for your roster, but a solid starting piece on your fantasy lineup. And thinking long-term in Dynasty, maybe, who knows, Rashod Bateman goes somewhere else on a second contract, or the Ravens switch up their game plan.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the concern's the volume. And honestly, like, if we're looking at this situation and breaking it down, we can confidently say that the volume is not going to be lower than it was in 2020. I mean, 406 team pass attempts is just absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, even back to 2019, it was low, but it was 440, which is at least 34 more targets. So I expect them to open things up a little bit. Like I said, if they can just get 75, 100 more targets in this offense, it would be great. The Ravens, you already alluded to it, by far the least amount of targets to the wide receiver spot. Last season in 2020, only 221. Even those other situations you mentioned, the Tennessee Titans, they had 270 targets to the wide receiver. The Seattle Seahawks don't throw it a ton, but when they do, it does go to the wide receiver with 330 targets to the wide receiver. So it's like this compounding negative effect for wide receivers in Baltimore that, one, they don't throw the ball very much, and two, when they do, the percentage of targets going to wide receiver is in the bottom half of the league. So to me, it's chicken or egg situation. Is this just always going to be a low volume passing offense, no targets going to the wide receiver regardless of who the receivers are? Or has it been a low volume passing offense, no targets to the wide receiver because they don't have any impact guys there? I think it's a little bit of both. And this season, I do expect that volume to come up. So honestly, I don't think there's a lot of debate about Bateman's talent. I don't think there's a lot of debate that he's going to be the number one guy in Baltimore. If not as a rookie, then definitely in 2022. I think the only debate and the thing that we're going to have to figure out is what is the passing attack going to look like and how many targets are going to be distributed between Rashod Bateman and Hollywood Brown in Baltimore.
For most of these wide receivers, they aren't going to break out in year one, but I'm optimistic in the face of all the landing spot doubters against Rashod Bateman.